Like everything in art, drawing clothes well involves a bunch of complex technical skills. So, I've broken them down into 5 stages, getting more complex as we go. And let's start things off with gravity. Gravity is one of the main fundamentals of drawing clothing, and you know how much us artists absolutely love our fundamentals. Almost everything we draw is going to have a force of some kind applied to it. Whether it's the force of your character moving or the wind, gravity will always have its effect. So, as we apply gravity to a fabric, we can observe how it warps itself around the object it's placed upon. Friction then holds the fabric on top of that object. Why am I telling you this? Because that's pretty much how clothes sit on people. For example, to keep things easy, we can imagine the top of everything we draw to be a flat surface on which our fabric sits upon. If we had our arm out, for example, the fabric would fold around our arm from the top and then dangle down to the bottom. A final thing to note is as the material gets towards its ends, it becomes lighter and loses a lot of its mass, therefore becoming creased and appearing slightly wobbly. Now that I've said that, you'll see it everywhere. This also happens in hair a lot of the time. Towards the bottom of the hair strands, the hair tends to flick up as it gets lighter. These points where the fabric is loose can be connected directly to our pinch points to create realistic looking folds. And now that I've mentioned them, let's get to explaining them. Learning the standard location of pinch points is going to be one of the most useful things you take away from this video. But remember, the location of these points will change depending on the pose and many other factors. So, to make sure you get it right every time, it's as simple as this. Tension points and pinch points appear where the clothing is either resting on an object or being physically manipulated by it. This could be the top of your character's shoulder or them pinching the side of their skirt. If we take a look at the places on the body where the clothing is resting or pinched, we can then draw a line down from that point to get some of these desired lines. Now, the easiest way to get realistic and simple looking folds is to simply draw lines between these points of tension, and depending on how far down you draw the lines and how much you make them droop, basically dictates how tight the clothing will appear. Gesture. It's something we use to draw our characters, right? Well, it can also be used for clothing. If we draw a gestural line through our clothing from our pinch point, it can help guide the placements of the creases we're adding. This becomes particularly useful if your character's clothing is blowing in the wind, as giving it a line of gesture just helps you wrap your head around it a little better. Now, if we do a little study of how clothing is folding around our body, you can see that there's little triangles appearing in all the folds and creases. The reason the shape appears to be triangular all comes back to the pinch points we mentioned earlier, as if you simply draw 2 lines from that point, well, you create a triangle. Keep this in mind when drawing your own triangles on your clothing. They don't just appear randomly but form around pinch points. By using such basic shapes, it helps give our clothing a real 3D look whilst keeping it super simple. This means we're able to rotate something as complicated and complex as a trouser leg with relative ease. Now, I personally like to use shapes to make my folds and creases, but I've seen some artists use things like letters. This can work well too, so try it out and see if it works for you.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4!
Okay, it's time to start thinking about what we can't see. There are a couple of methods and techniques you can use when making your clothing look more 3D. One of the main ones being overlapping shapes. Using our pinch points example from earlier, you can see how the lines we've drawn give the effect of the fabric overlapping itself. This is an important thing to remember as every line we draw represents an overlapping line. So when you're drawing your lines, don't just draw them everywhere, but draw them where the material is physically overlapping another part of itself. This is one of the main problems artists make when drawing, so keep your eye out for it. Knowing this is going to be super useful later when it comes to adding shadow. One of the main benefits to drawing folds on your clothing is how it can give your character 3D form without needing any shade whatsoever. That said, to get that 3D effect really working well, we need to make sure that when we draw our folds, we draw them warping around the body, or whatever object we're actually drawing. For example, if we were to draw our little character here with her arm in the air, her coat will rotate itself around her arm, creating directional lines from the point of tension. By rotating our lines around the object instead of just drawing them straight, we're able to trick our brains into believing that the clothing has a little bit of depth, once again helping our drawing look more 3D without needing any shade. Now, the final thing we're going to talk about is probably one of the first things you want to think about: material. Different materials are going to change pretty much every single point we've mentioned so far, so it's important to understand and realize what materials you're going to use in your character beforehand. As you can see, using our example from earlier, if we compare the size of the triangles that we drew, depending on how tight the material is, simply dictates how tight and sharp the triangles are going to appear. Now, this might not be the case 100% of the time, But for the majority, the looser the material, the wider and less lines you're going to draw. Another thing to do when drawing looser fabric is making it more round and circular. A denser fabric will tend to have less lines than a thinner fabric, as it's going to have less creases, and some puffy or feather-filled clothing will tend to have creases around the joints and not really anywhere else. There's always going to be certain materials that create really interesting crease properties, so always make sure you find more than one reference and look for the forms and shapes that create those creases to basically simplify it and make it way easier to draw. There are a couple of websites you can go to for finding clothing references, but for me, I like to just go on shopping sites and just find like really nice clothing on just like a general shopping site. But to find some more unique clothing, websites like Pinterest are great when you're not looking at AI, and sites like Tokyo Fashion have a great selection of interesting outfits to practice drawing. Now, I know I said 5, but since you guys have been so well behaved, let's chuck in another one. Number 6, rendering. When it comes to rendering, we're going to use 3 main tools to basically do all of our rendering. Obviously, the main default brush is a great tool and asset, so we're going to use that. But this time, we're going to use the lasso tool and the airbrush tool just to help make things even easier. Now, there's a million ways to render, but I personally only use 2. I either get my base shadows down first if I'm doing something complex and complicated, or if I'm doing something relatively easy, I get my base colors down first. One of the main benefits to getting all your shadows down first is how much easier it makes understanding where the light's coming from and drawing that on the character itself. By making everything simple and black and white, you can really understand that exact lighting direction and just basically paint in where the light's hitting the character and not have to worry about colours and textures or anything else. Here our sun's coming from a pretty standard point of view, so we're going to use the lasso tool and basically cut out all the places where the sun won't hit. This will form our deep and dark shadows. Now, like I've said before, the shadow wants to appear where the clothing is overlapping itself. Now we have our base colour and our darkest shadows down, it's time to add the highlights. We're going to blast over with a lighter shade of grey where the sun is hitting most intensely on the character, whilst also remembering to add that refraction light on areas where the sun is bouncing against an object and then propelling back onto it. We're not going to go into too much detail with this as it's a short video, but that's basically what's happening. And there we have it, our base shadows are down. Now all we need to do is colouring the whole character and then just paint in the colours and all the shadows will be done for us. This helps keep things super consistent and stops you having light coming from all kinds of different directions. If we turn our line art off, you can see how it still looks like a 3D form, which means we've got our shadows placed in the correct position. If her arm appeared like it was blending in with the back of her jumper, that means that we'd probably need to add a little bit of shadow under there to add some depth and make things look more 3D. And with that, time to get drawing. Good luck.